The executioner doesn't carry an axe today. No swift steel, no merciful blade. Instead, his weapon glows in the morning sun. A pair of iron pincers, heated until they scream red with fire. 10,000 people stand in a field outside Munich, and for once a mob has forgotten how to breathe. They know exactly what this means. This won't be quick. This won't even look like justice. This is going to be a carnival of cruelty. On the scaffold kneels Anna Pappenheimer, her body already a wreck from days of torture. She isn't standing proud like the heroic martyrs of paintings. Number. She is broken, bent, and bleeding, but her tormentors have one last performance prepared. Her sons. 2 boys, grown men but still her children, are chained like dogs to posts nearby. They are forced to watch. Their eyes are wide, trembling with the kind of horror no soul should carry. The executioner reaches out with those hellish pincers. He doesn't go for her throat. He goes for her chest. The iron clamps down, and what tears through the silence is not a scream, not the sound of flesh burning. No, it's something worse. It's the sound of a human spirit cracking in half. It's the sound of a world where mercy has gone extinct, where God has turned his face away, and only devils are left to run the show. This moment is not about law, not about sin, not about God. This is theater, a theater of pain choreographed for terror. The message written in scorched flesh is simple. This is what happens when power needs a victim. But cruelty like this doesn't pop out of thin air. It isn't improvised. It's built, piece by piece, step by step, like a nightmare constructed in daylight. To understand how one ordinary Bavarian family, the Pappenheimers, ended up as the centerpiece in Germany's most infamous witch trial, we have to crawl backwards through their misery. Because this was not just about killing them. No, the plan was obliteration. The destruction of their names, their bodies, their children, their story until nothing was left but ash. The story begins, fittingly, with the dead. Anna grew up in a small Bavarian town, and her father's profession was already a curse. He was the grave digger, the man who lifted rotting corpses, who lowered bodies into the earth, who touched death every day with his bare hands. In a world soaked in superstition, where religion and fear tangled like vines, that made him and his family unclean, untouchable, permanently stained. Imagine little Anna at 6 or 7 years old wandering through the market square. What do the other children do? They scatter as if death itself walks in pigtails. Mothers yank their children close, whispering prayers like Anna is carrying the plague on her skin. The baker doesn't even hand her bread directly. He drops it on the counter like she's diseased, then backs away. That's what it meant to be born into shadow. You weren't just poor, you were something less than human. But here's the thing about being cast out. It creates its own gravity. The exiles find each other. The misfits recognize their own. That's how Anna met Paulus. He too had been branded by society. His family's job, cleaning the sewers, handling human waste. Every night they climbed into the pits of filth that kept everyone else clean. Everyone needed them, but nobody wanted to admit it. He was another shadow person, and in Anna he saw someone who understood. When Anna and Paulus married, it wasn't just love, though there was real affection by all accounts. It was survival. It was 2 scarred souls saying, "The world already hates us. Let's face it together." Their vows weren't just about God or family. They were about building a fortress of 2 against the entire human race that had already spat them out. Children came quickly. Simon first, then little Gumpre, and finally Michelle, the youngest. Each child brought joy, yes, but also dread. These weren't just children. They were tiny shadows already cursed before they could even speak. Born into the filth-stained world of their parents, carrying the mark of untouchability before they took their first steps. The timing couldn't have been worse. Poverty in Bavaria was always dangerous. But by the turn of the 17th century, it was fatal. The 30 Years' War was brewing. Religious tensions snapped like static in every town, and fear hung heavier than smoke. Being poor was bad. Being poor and ritually unclean? That was like painting a bullseye on your forehead. Still, the Pappenheimers tried to live. Paulus took whatever scraps of work he could, hauling loads, repairing broken tools, jobs nobody else wanted. Anna raised the children, teaching them invisibility. Keep your heads down. Speak little. Survive. The family moved from place to place, never long enough to become known, never long enough to put down roots, always dodging starvation, always dancing at the edge of disaster. But you can't hide forever. Isolation breeds suspicion. When you already wear the stink of filth and death, every misfortune starts to bend toward you. A cow dies unexpectedly? Someone remembers the gravedigger's daughter walked by that field. A well runs dry? People whisper that Paulus was seen near it days before. At first, they were just whispers, uneasy glances. But whispers pile up, glances harden. Fear calcifies into certainty, and certainty in a world this hysterical was lethal. For years they scraped by, invisible people on the margins, living in shacks on the edges of towns. They were tolerated like rats, necessary to deal with filth, but never welcome, never human enough. Yet they were still a family. They shared meager meals, told each other stories, clung to small joys. In the records, you won't find a single hint of evil, not a theft, not a crime. Their only sin was poverty, their only curse the professions of their fathers. That should have been punishment enough. Social death, being spat on, living in shacks nobody wanted, that should have been their only cross. But Bavaria in 1600 was not satisfied with letting the poor suffer quietly. To be an outcast here wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lethal. And the Pappenheimers, cursed since birth, were about to learn the darkest truth of all. In a world drunk on superstition, being nobody meant you could be turned into anybody's monster. Knock, knock, knock. Every sound at the door was a loaded gun for the Pappenheimer family. By the year 1590, Bavaria decided that poverty itself was illegal. Imagine that. Being broke wasn't just miserable anymore, it was a crime. The wandering poor, the beggars, the families without a roof over their heads, they weren't just unwanted now, they were criminals. And the Pappenheimers, forever roaming like ghosts from town to town, fell straight into that noose. Picture their life. Every time Paulus stepped outside looking for work, every time Anna crept through the streets with her children to beg for scraps, they were technically breaking the law. Breathing as a poor person was now punishable. The sound of hooves clattering on cobblestones sent shivers through their bones. Was it a merchant, or was it the guards coming to drag them away? Survival itself had become treason. Now desperation does something nasty to people. It makes them risk what looks insane from the safe distance of comfort. One night, with the children crying from hunger, Paulus broke. He grabbed onto a job offer. Not just day labor, but steady work, the kind of work that meant food on the table. The catch? It was the filthiest job anyone could imagine, cleaning privies. Let me make this clear. Waste handlers in Bavaria weren't just poor. They were the absolute rock bottom. The people who descended into cesspits at night, shoveling human shit into carts. They were called night crawlers, ghost men, living reminders that civilization was built on somebody else's filth. Nobody wanted to see them in daylight. Nobody wanted to admit they were necessary. Yet without them, whole towns would drown in their own excrement. But for Paulus, it was work. Work meant survival. And survival meant his children wouldn't starve. That's how the family earned the cursed name Pappenheimer. Maybe it came from the paper used in privies. Maybe it was twisted from some place name. But the meaning was carved in stone. You are what you handle. Filth. Imagine Anna's face when Paulus told her. Relief and horror colliding. Yes, they could finally stay in one place, finally breathe for a moment, but at what cost? Now their children would inherit not just poverty, but a brand. They'd be raised as the spawn of the cesspit, the ones the town spat at while secretly relying on. Even little Michelle, barely old enough to understand the word shit, was already chained to it by blood. So the family settled, if you can call it that, in the foulest part of town. A place where the air stank of tanneries, rotting hides, and desperation. Paulus went out each night wrapped in rough cloth, shovel in hand, trudging from house to house to scoop out what everyone else flushed away and forgot. The sound of his shovel scraping stone, the splash of filth hitting wood, this became the family's lullaby. But even in that sewer life, there were flickers of humanity. Anna keeping the children quiet so Paulus could sleep through the day. The family huddling around a pitiful meal, laughing at the smallest joke, sharing scraps like they were a feast. For a brief time, they had stability, if you can call breathing stable, while everyone around you wishes you didn't exist. Of course, society didn't let them forget their place. The children were branded right alongside their parents. Other kids threw stones. They shouted the word Pappenheimer like it was both insult and curse. Simon, the eldest, fought back with fists. Gumpre retreated inward, turning silent and watchful. Michel, the baby, clung to his mother's skirts, wide-eyed, not understanding why the world treated him like garbage before he even had the chance to grow. And even this wretched security was fragile. Being an official waste handler was only one step higher than outlaw. Miss a tax payment? Too sick to work one night? Upset the wrong townsman? Back into the streets you go, criminals again for the crime of existing. The Pappenheimer mayors had traded invisibility for a spotlight of disgust. They weren't just outsiders anymore. They were the official untouchables, the bogeymen of town. Everyone knew their name, spat it with disgust, and yet needed them in the dark. They worked in shit so the rest of the world could pretend to be clean, and they thought this was rock bottom. They thought there was no deeper pit. But they hadn't met the real monster yet, the one waiting in chains, ready to say their name in exchange for his life. One thief, one desperate liar, was about to drag the Pappenheimers out of the cesspit and into hell. It started with a thief, a rat in chains, rotting in a Munich cell around the year 1600. He was already condemned. Execution dangled over his head like a blade, and the jailers whispered the sweetest poison. Confess more, give us names, give us crimes, and maybe you'll live. So the thief opened his mouth. At first it was small stuff. Robberies, petty crimes. He ratted on other lowlifes, hoping it would buy him time. But the interrogators wanted something juicier. They wanted witches, devils, shadows. Every society that reeks of fear craves monsters, and these men were hungry for blood. And then the thief spoke the name that would doom a family, Pappenheimer. The story he spun was grotesque genius. He didn't just say they were dirty waste handlers. No, he made them into nightmare creatures. According to his fantasy, the Pappenheimers stalked pregnant women, murdered them, and used the fat of their unborn babies to craft magic candles. Candles that, when lit, made the bearer invisible. Let that sink in. The cesspit family had now been recast as sorcerers, butcherers, monsters straight from a nightmare. And the brilliance of the lie was in its horror. Parents already lived in fear of losing children. Babies were fragile, death common. Now the Pappenheimers weren't just despised for their filth, they were cast as hunters of infants, demons in human skin. The interrogators leaned in. Oh, they loved this. Not because they truly believed it, at least not at first, but because it was perfect. It was sensational. It was exactly the kind of filth that could justify anything they wanted to do next. The thief, sensing their delight, poured it on thicker. The Pappenheimers weren't just killers. They were part of a satanic network. They had dozens, maybe hundreds of victims. They met with the devil himself under moonlight. Bavaria in 1600 was tinder waiting for a spark. The Catholic Counter-Reformation was in full rage. Protestants and Catholics loathed each other. Fear was currency, and tales of witches gave everyone a common enemy. Who better to fit that role than a family already despised, already smeared with filth? The lie spread like wildfire through the halls of power. Suddenly, every unexplained death, every stillborn child, every missing soul had a scapegoat, the Pappenheimers. The waste handlers who worked in the shadows had now become Bavaria's bogeymen. And here's the sick part. The very absurdity of the claim gave it power. Who, people thought, would invent something so revolting? Surely there must be some truth. The lie's grotesqueness became its proof. No one investigated. No one asked for evidence. They had the thief's word, and apparently that was enough. Meanwhile, the Pappenheimer family trudged through their misery, clueless that their names were being carved into a death sentence. Paulus still shoveled excrement. Anna still begged, still scraped together food for the children. Simon, Gumpre, and little Michel still endured taunts and stones from other children. Their lives were already unbearable, and yet they had no idea that somewhere, in a dark cell, a desperate thief had just lit the fuse that would blow them to hell. The story ballooned as gossip does. Soon it wasn't just dead babies and candles. Whispers painted them as ringleaders of satanic orgies. They weren't just making cursed candles. They were selling them to criminals and witches across Bavaria. By the time the tale hit the ears of officials, the Pappenheimers had been transformed from despised outcasts into Bavaria's greatest existential threat. And then the lie rolled upward to the man who needed it most, Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria. A peacock of power draped in ambition, dreaming of being Europe's Catholic champion, he wanted to be the man who restored order, who purged sin, who proved he was God's favorite weapon. but his subjects were restless, jittery, sick with fear of witches and devils. He needed a spectacle, something bloody, something divine, something that screamed, "I alone protect you" from the darkness. When the report about the Pappenheimers hit his desk, it must have looked like a gift from heaven wrapped in human skin. Outcasts accused of unspeakable crimes. No friends, no allies, no noble blood to defend them. Just a family of dirt, ripe for sacrifice. Perfect pawns in the Duke's theater of power. The arrest would not be quiet. No, this was going to be a parade of chains and humiliation. Soldiers would storm their wretched tavern at dawn, boots thundering, steel flashing, children screaming as they were ripped from their mother's arms. And the Duke would get exactly what he wanted: a stage set with human suffering, an audience frothing with fear, and a performance of cruelty dressed up as divine justice. The thief got his reprieve. The Pappenheimers got their death sentence. The wheel of hell had begun to turn. The Pappenheimers didn't even know their death warrant had already been signed. They were dragged from a tavern like stray dogs, their screams echoing against the cobblestones while neighbors peeked from doorways, whispering prayers they didn't mean. This wasn't an arrest. It was theater. Picture Paulus stumbling out into the cold dawn, his legs weak from a night of work, his eyes bleary with exhaustion. Then the thunder hits. Soldiers, armored and armed, far more than needed for a family of beggars. They crash through the door, rip the family apart like wolves on prey. Anna screams, clawing like a wild animal. The records say she had to be subdued, as if any mother would stand still while armed men tear children from her arms. Michel, 10 years old, clung to her skirts until a soldier ripped him away. Gumpre tried to bolt, but was caught after a few steps. Simon, the eldest, froze. He knew resistance was pointless. And the neighbors? They watched. Some crossed themselves, others turned away. Nobody dared interfere. Who would risk themselves for the Pappenheimers? The town's human trash. Everyone instinctively understood. This wasn't about justice. These weren't people anymore. These were props for a show. Meanwhile, inside his palace dripping with gold, Duke Maximilian already plotted the performance. A quiet trial? Forget it. He wanted fireworks. A morality play that would echo across Europe. He ordered the best interrogators. He demanded updates, confessions, names. He didn't want just killers. He wanted witches, devil worshippers, an entire satanic conspiracy. And the Pappenheimers? Perfect casting. The family was split apart immediately, a tactic sharpened by centuries of cruelty. Paulus thrown into the men's prison, Anna shoved into a cell barely large enough to stretch out in. The children locked with hardened criminals who amused themselves by terrifying them with tales of what happens to witch spawn. This wasn't just isolation. This was psychological warfare. The stage was set. Now the show began. They started with Paulus. Dragged naked into a stone chamber under the Munich prison, his body was shaved to check for the devil's marks. Really, it was ritual humiliation, the stripping of dignity before the real fun began. The walls around him were lined with devices born from minds twisted with genius and sadism. The rack, the thumb screws, the boots that crushed bones, pincers glowing red in the brazier. Tools of faith sharpened into weapons of torment. The interrogators began gently. Thumb screws tightened until bone cracked like dry wood. Paulus screamed denial. They were innocent, just a poor family. That wasn't enough. Next came the boots. Wooden devices cranked tighter and tighter until his legs turned blue. Circulation cut, tissue dying. Still he cried innocence. But the interrogators knew the trick. Pain alone doesn't always break a man. Love does. So they brought in Anna. Imagine Paulus, strapped and mangled, forced to watch as his wife was dragged in, forced to watch as they positioned her where he could see her face, hear her voice. The records are vague about what was done to Anna. Vague because the truth was too vile to record. But we know this. It was deliberate, methodical, escalating. Every scream that tore out of her throat ripped Paulus apart. Every tear on her face was worse than the boots crushing his bones. And finally he broke. Words spilled out of him, not because they were true, but because they were currency. Mercy bought with lies. Yes, they killed. Yes, they made candles from babies. Yes, they consorted with the devil. His voice cracked under agony, and the interrogators leaned in, pressing for more. How many? Where? When? They forced absurd numbers from him. 400 children. 400. The sheer impossibility should have been proof of innocence. But logic had been banished from that chamber. Pain had become the only scripture. Anna, too, was shredded into confessions. She babbled of flying through the night on a demon's fork, of grinding infant bones into powder, of coupling with devils in obscene rituals. The words don't read like testimony. They read like fever dreams of a mind shattered by torment. But to the Duke's men, this was holy scripture, inked in blood and screams. Even the children weren't spared. 10-year-old Michelle was tortured lightly, though what that means for a child's body is unspeakable. He too confessed, parroting back the lies planted in him by men with iron tools and dead eyes. By the end, the Pappenheimers were monsters, at least on paper. The interrogators got their story, the Duke got his witch cult, and the family, broken and destroyed, had signed their own death sentence with hands that barely held a quill. They weren't finished yet. The machine wanted more names, more victims. The blood feast had just begun. The torture chamber was never just about confessions. It was about multiplication. The machine didn't want one family of witches. It wanted hundreds. And so the Pappenheimers, already shattered, were pushed into the filthiest bargain of all. Betray others or drown in agony. Picture Paulus, sprawled on the floor of his cell, his legs useless from the boots, his hands mangled into claws by screws. He hasn't had a sip of water in days. His lips are split, his tongue a slab of leather. Then an interrogator strolls in with a pitcher. Not wine, not broth, just water. But to a man on the edge of death, that pitcher might as well be divine nectar. One name, the interrogator says. One accomplice. Say it and you drink. This is the degradation of the human soul, trading lives for gulps. Paulus knew it was madness. He knew everyone was innocent. He knew because he was innocent, because the whole story was stitched together from screams and fire. But pain is a sculptor and thirst a hammer. Finally, he whispers a name. A neighbor who had once shown them kindness. The interrogator smiled. Paulus was allowed a sip, then another demand. More names? Another sip. Another life condemned. The bargain twisted into a rhythm. Water for blood, relief for betrayal. Anna faced the same torture, only hers was psychological. They told her Paulus had already named dozens of accomplices. Why protect those who were doomed anyway? Why keep silent when silence just meant more pain, more screams, more time apart from her children? And didn't she want to see them again? The questions drilled her like iron spikes, and in her weakness, she broke. She confirmed names. She added more. The children were manipulated differently, poisoned with lies. Guards told them their parents had already confessed everything, that God was furious with them, that only more names would ease his wrath. Michel, the youngest, only 10 years old, began blurting out anyone he could remember. The baker who once gave stale bread, the tavern keeper who let them hide from rain, even other beggar children. Each childish memory became a weapon sharpened by interrogators' pens. And when the family ran out of people they actually knew, the interrogators helpfully suggested more. What about the miller's wife? Didn't you see her at a gathering? And the Pappenheimers, desperate for any scrap of approval, agreed. Yes, the miller's wife, of course. By the time the naming frenzy ended, more than 400 people had been implicated. 400 souls condemned by the broken voices of one family. Each name was a spark, flaring outward, igniting more arrests, more torture, more names. The lie had grown legs. It was no longer about the Pappenheimers. It was about a vast satanic conspiracy blotting out Bavaria. The results were catastrophic. Some of the names fled immediately, their escape used as proof of guilt. Others were dragged into cells and tortured until they too gave up names. The nightmare replicated like a plague. What began with one thief's desperate lie became a wildfire of accusation, consuming towns, neighbors, entire families. And the Pappenheimers knew what they had done. In the scraps of silence between tortures, in the moments when they weren't screaming or babbling lies, they must have felt it. The faces of those they had condemned haunted them. They had been turned from victims into tools, their agony weaponized to destroy the innocent. The interrogators were delighted. They had spun a satanic empire out of thin air, built entirely on broken bones and parched throats. The Duke had his network, the panic had its proof, and the Pappenheimers had been ground into something worse than corpses. They had been made executioners in their own destruction. But the machine wasn't finished. Confessions and names were only Act 1. The Duke wanted a finale that would sear itself into the memory of Bavaria. And that meant blood, fire, and the kind of public execution that scarred generations. July 29, 1600. Munich woke not to birdsong but to drums and bells. This wasn't a normal morning. This was a festival of blood. Duke Maximilian wanted a performance, and his executioners built him one. For days, workers had lined the streets, preparing the 2-mile route from the prison to the execution ground. This wasn't about killing criminals. This was about showing 10,000 witnesses exactly who held the whip of power. The Pappenheimers were dragged from their cells before dawn, washed, dressed in the white shirts of the condemned, paraded like cattle to slaughter. But before their journey, one final cruelty. The family was reunited. Paulus, Anna, their eldest son Simon, and the 2 younger boys, Gumpre and Michel, stood together, seeing each other for the last time. Imagine it. Parents looking at children who would be murdered before nightfall. Children staring at parents already broken, knowing nothing good waited ahead. That brief moment of goodbye was salt rubbed into wounds. The procession began. Paulus, his legs destroyed, was hauled in a cart. Not mercy, just practicality. They needed him awake to suffer. Anna and Simon walked in chains. The younger boys were carried by guards, their faces blank masks of terror. Along the route, stations had been prepared. Little theaters of torment. At the first, the executioner heated pincers until they glowed and tore chunks of flesh from Paulus's arms and chest. The crowd inhaled as the smell of burning meat drifted. The drums kept beating. The parade never stopped. At the second station, the pincers bit into his legs. At the third, his back. Every scream was part of the score. Priests marched alongside, bellowing for him to repent while the mob gawked. Repent? They were ripping him apart in God's name. The irony was obscene. The reactions of the crowd were a twisted mirror of humanity. Some cheered like it was theater. Others stared in silence, realizing this could be them, their families, if fortune turned. Parents lifted their children onto shoulders so the next generation could learn. This is what happens to devils. Anna was forced to watch every second. That was her torture. Her husband shredded before her eyes while she clutched her sons. Simon, the eldest, tried to comfort her. But what comfort exists when you're walking toward your own execution? Gumpre and Michel, too young to comprehend the machinery of power, still understood one thing. Their father was being destroyed piece by piece. When they reached the field, Paulus was more dead than alive. He was strapped to the breaking wheel, bones jutting, flesh charred, displayed like a grotesque crucifix. Normally, a mercy blow would end the suffering. Not today. Maximilian demanded he linger, gasping, rotting, as a monument of pain. His body became propaganda. Look how far the Duke's justice can reach. And then came Anna. The crowd thought they'd seen cruelty already. They hadn't. She was bound to the stake, her husband's corpse hanging behind her like a broken effigy. But before the fire was lit, the executioner performed one more ritual of humiliation. He tore open her shirt. Before her children's eyes, he cut away her breasts. The mutilated flesh was pressed against the mouths of her sons. A perverse mockery of motherhood, a ritualized desecration of the bond between parent and child. The field fell silent. Even in an age where public executions were entertainment, this crossed into horror. Only then did they light the fire. Anna died screaming, her body consumed, her children forced to watch the only comfort they had in life reduced to ash. Simon was next. He was beheaded quickly, mercifully compared to the inferno his parents endured. But mercy is relative when you're executed after witnessing your family torn apart. The youngest boys were saved for last, saved in as if their fate was anything but. Michel, only 10, was too young to execute immediately. So they kept him alive, if you can call it that, in Jesuit custody. They baptized him again, gave him a new name, and whispered daily that his parents were devils. For 3 months he lived in religious purgatory, his trauma weaponized, his soul caged. Then on November 26, 1600, he was strangled and burned, 10 years old, murdered for being born into the wrong family. Gumpre, his brother, met the same fate. The records barely cared enough to note when. The spectacle achieved its goal. Fear rippled across Bavaria. Hundreds of names given under torture led to more arrests, more screams, more executions. Entire families vanished. Neighbors turned on each other before accusations could reach them. Duke Maximilian stood tall, praised as the defender of faith, the hammer of witches. But the truth was simpler. The Pappenheimers were innocent. They weren't witches, they weren't killers, they were poor, they were powerless, and that made them perfect. Their story isn't about witchcraft. It's about how fear and power can strip flesh, burn children, and call it holy justice. It's about how civilization rots when mercy dies. And it's about how a family nobody wanted alive became immortal, as a warning of how far human cruelty can reach.